Dearest listeners, there exists in the annals of our most illustrious society a particular species of gentleman who, when confronted with genuine virtue in distress, reveals the true measure of his character. Tonight, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of sacrifice, redemption, and love triumphant against the darkest of circumstances. A tale wherein a childhood bond, thought severed by tragedy, proves stronger than death itself. But let us not rush through such delicate matters, for the finest stories, like the most exquisite Burgundy, must be savored with proper attention. Indeed, if this chronicle of hearts, reunited against impossible odds, stirs your own sensibilities, I do entreat you to mark your approval, share these tales with fellow devotees of true romance, and leave word of which manner of story you wish to hear next, for it is your patronage that allows these histories to be preserved. The autumn of 1813 found Miss Amelia Hartwell in circumstances no gently bred young lady of 21 years should ever have been forced to endure. Yet Providence, that capricious mistress, cares little for what should or should not be, and concerns herself only with what is. What was, on that grey October morning, was this. Miss Hartwell resided in one of Covent Garden's more genteel establishments of ill repute, her presence there the culmination of a series of catastrophes that would have broken a lesser spirit entirely. To comprehend how such a dreadful situation had come to pass, one must journey backward through the years to a time when Amelia Hartwell had been a child of 9, blessed with copper-bright tresses that caught fire in the sunlight, and a laugh that rang through the gardens of Hartwell Manor like church bells on Easter morning. Her father, Sir Thomas Hartwell, had been a baronet of modest means but considerable charm, whilst her mother, the former Miss Sarah Denison, had brought grace and gentle wisdom to their Hertfordshire estate. Young Amelia had wanted for nothing save perhaps greater companionship, for the neighboring estates were few, and playmates of suitable station rarer still. It was thus that the friendship between Amelia Hartwell and Christopher Beaumont had flourished with such particular intensity. The Beaumonts' country seat, Silvermere Hall, lay but 3 miles distant from Hartwell Manor, and the families had maintained cordial relations for generations. Christopher, then 11 years of age, had been the second son of the Earl of Windermere, a circumstance that afforded him considerable freedom from the burdensome expectations placed upon his elder brother, William. Where William was being groomed for future responsibilities, Christopher was permitted the luxury of childhood, and he had spent countless summer afternoons exploring the woods between the 2 estates with his copper-haired companion. Those had been golden days, filled with the innocent adventures of youth. They had built fortresses from fallen branches, waged imaginary battles against French invaders, and shared secrets beside the old oak that marked the boundary between their families' lands. Christopher had sworn, with all the solemnity a boy of 11 could muster, that he would always protect Amelia Hartwell, no matter what trials might come. She had believed him absolutely, as children do, and had pressed a handkerchief embroidered with her initials into his palm as a token of their eternal friendship. He had tucked it carefully into his coat pocket, treating it with the reverence a knight might accord a lady's favor. Then had come the night that altered everything, the night that would haunt Amelia's dreams for 12 years hence. She remembered even now, with painful clarity, how she had been reading in the library by candlelight, a practice her mother had gently discouraged but never expressly forbidden. The volume had been a collection of fairy stories, filled with tales of princesses rescued and true love triumphant. How bitterly ironic those stories would seem in years to come. She had grown drowsy as the evening deepened, and in her tiredness, she must have knocked the candle as she rose to seek her bed. She had made it halfway up the grand staircase when she heard her mother's scream. The fire had spread with terrifying speed through the old manor, consuming timber and tapestry with equal voracity. Amelia had been pulled from the building by their butler, Matthews, who had perished himself when he returned to seek her parents. Sir Thomas and Lady Hartwell had been trapped in their chambers, overcome by smoke before the flames reached them. The local magistrate had ruled it a tragic accident, the consequence of an overturned lamp in Sir Thomas's study. No one had known about the candle in the library, and Amelia, traumatized and mute with grief, had not spoken of it. She had been sent to live with her father's sister, Mrs. Marjorie Talbot, a widow of stern disposition who resided in a draughty house in Lincolnshire. The Beaumonts had called once, she recalled, Lord and Lady Windermere, expressing their condolences with appropriate gravity. Christopher had been away at school, and by the time he returned, the Talbots had already departed. Amelia had left behind the handkerchief he had given her, along with every other remnant of her former life. The years at Mrs. Talbot's residence had been grey and cheerless. Her aunt had possessed sufficient fortune to provide for Amelia's basic needs, but little inclination to show affection or launch her niece properly into society. Instead, Amelia had been raised in near isolation, her education continuing through the efforts of a succession of impoverished governesses who stayed as briefly as they could manage. She had grown from a lively child into a quiet young woman, her copper hair still brilliant, but her spirit dimmed by loss and lovelessness. When Amelia reached 18, Mrs. Talbot had declared her obligation fulfilled and had set about arranging a match that would remove her niece from her household permanently. The gentleman selected for this purpose was Viscount Grimsby, a man of 64 years whose previous 3 wives had all died under circumstances that were whispered about but never openly discussed. He was wealthy, titled, and willing to accept a bride without fortune or connections, which had been quite sufficient for Mrs. Talbot's purposes. Amelia had met her intended husband precisely once before the betrothal was announced. The encounter had taken place in Mrs. Talbot's drawing room, with her aunt presiding over the interview with grim satisfaction. Lord Grimsby had been a corpulent man, with yellowed teeth and hands that trembled slightly when he reached for his tea. He had examined Amelia with the assessing eye of a horse trader evaluating potential purchase, his gaze lingering upon her figure in a manner that made her skin crawl beneath her modest muslin gown. The betrothal had been formalized with indecent haste, and preparations had begun for a wedding to take place within 3 months. Amelia, who had learned through long years with her aunt that protest was futile, had accepted her fate with outward composure. Yet as the wedding date approached, Lord Grimsby had begun to visit more frequently, and his behavior had grown increasingly inappropriate despite her aunt's presence. His hands would find reasons to touch her arm, her shoulder, her waist. His breath, sour with wine and worse, would be hot upon her neck as he whispered of the marital duties she would soon be required to perform. Mrs. Talbot, blind to or unconcerned with her niece's distress, had merely remarked that a wife must accustom herself to her husband's attentions. It had been during one particularly dreadful visit, when Lord Grimsby had cornered Amelia in the conservatory and pressed his wet mouth to hers, whilst his hands groped at her bodice, that something within her had broken free from the careful control she had maintained for so long. In that moment of violation, she had known with absolute certainty that death would be preferable to marriage to such a man. That very night, whilst the household slept, she had gathered what few possessions she could carry, taken the small cache of coins she had managed to save over the years from the parsimonious pin money her aunt grudgingly provided, and fled into the darkness. London had seemed her only refuge, that great sprawling metropolis where a young woman might disappear amongst the masses and begin anew. How foolish, how desperately naive she had been. She had possessed no references, no acquaintances, no understanding whatsoever of how a woman alone might survive in such a city. The modest coins she had brought lasted barely a week, spent on the cheapest lodgings she could find and the barest sustenance. She had attempted to secure respectable employment as a governess or companion, but without references or family connections, every door had been closed to her. It had been Mrs. Violet Marchmont, proprietress of an elegant establishment on the better end of Covent Garden, who had found Amelia sleeping in a doorway one rain-soaked evening. Mrs. Marchmont had been a handsome woman of middle years, dressed in silks that whispered of wealth and wearing an expression of shrewd assessment that Amelia would come to know well. She had taken the desperate girl in, fed her, clothed her in borrowed finery, and explained the nature of the household Amelia had entered. The establishment catered to gentlemen of quality who desired discretion along with their pleasure. The young women who resided there were treated well by the standards of their profession, protected from violence, and compensated handsomely for their services. Mrs. Marchmont had been quite clear about what would be expected of Amelia, and quite equally clear that refusing these expectations would result in her immediate return to the streets from which she had been rescued. Amelia had been given a fortnight to accustom herself to her new circumstances, a period during which she was lodged, fed, and dressed in finery she had never imagined wearing. Mrs. Marchmont had explained that her copper hair and air of quality would command premium prices from the right gentleman. Yet when the moment came for Amelia to be presented to potential patrons, something had proven impossible. She would freeze, her body rigid with remembered fear of Lord Grimsby's touch, her mind unable to separate the violation he had attempted from the violation she was now expected to welcome. Mrs. Marchmont had been patient at first, then frustrated, then coldly furious. She had invested considerable resources in preparing Amelia for her role, and the girl's continued inability to perform was costing the establishment both money and reputation. After 3 weeks of failure, Mrs. Marchmont had presented Amelia with an ultimatum. The following evening, she would be introduced to Lord Renwick, a particular patron known for his preference for reluctant innocence. He would pay handsomely for the privilege of being her first, and Amelia would either fulfill her obligations or find herself returned to the streets with debts that would see her imprisoned in debtor's jail. The hours of that final day had crept past with agonizing slowness. Amelia had been bathed, perfumed, and dressed in a gown of emerald silk that left her shoulders bare and her bosom more exposed than any respectable garment would permit. Her copper hair had been arranged in elaborate curls, and her face had been painted with subtle art. She had looked in the glass and seen a stranger, a beautiful stranger who bore only superficial resemblance to the girl who had once laughed in the gardens of Hartwell Manor. As evening approached, she had been installed in one of the establishment's finest chambers, a room decorated in the Oriental style with crimson wallpaper and furnishings of dark lacquered wood. Mrs. Marchmont had instructed her to wait, to smile when Lord Renwick arrived, and to remember that resistance would only prolong the inevitable whilst ensuring her own suffering. Then she had been left alone with her terror and her shame. The sounds of the establishment's evening activities had drifted through the walls, masculine laughter, feminine giggles that held notes of performance rather than genuine mirth, the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation. Amelia had sat frozen upon the edge of the bed, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her nails had left crescents in her palms. In one fist, she clutched a threadbare handkerchief, its linen worn soft from years of handling. The initials A.H., still faintly visible in faded blue thread. It had been her mother's once, the only possession she had managed to keep through all the years of loss. She had prayed, though she scarcely knew to whom or for what. Deliverance seemed too much to hope for, yet she had hoped nonetheless, with the desperate fervor of the truly doomed. It had been nearing 11 o'clock when she heard footsteps approaching the chamber, followed by Mrs. Marchmont's voice speaking in tones of practiced welcome. The door had opened, and Amelia had risen automatically, her training overriding her terror. She had kept her eyes downcast, unable to look upon the man who had purchased her innocence, preparing herself for whatever was to come, her mother's handkerchief still clenched desperately in her hand. On the other side of that door, Christopher Beaumont had hesitated, inwardly cursing his friend Montague's insistence that he required a distraction from his troubles at such an establishment of dubious reputation. He had no desire whatsoever for purchased pleasures. His mind remained preoccupied with the burdens of his title and a betrothal that felt increasingly like a business treaty rather than a union of hearts. The life that stretched before him, a life of duty, political alliances, and responsibilities undertaken without joy, had begun to feel less like the honor his father had taught him to value, and more like a slow abandonment of everything that made existence worthwhile. He had opened the door with the resignation of a man fulfilling an unwanted social obligation, entirely unaware that he was about to encounter his destiny and the salvation of his own soul. Then he spoke a single word, a name that seemed to rise from the depths of memory unbidden. Amelia? Her head had snapped up, and she had found herself staring into the face of Christopher Beaumont, now grown into the full flower of manhood. He had been 11 when she had seen him last, a gangly boy with unruly dark hair and eyes that sparkled with mischief. The man before her now stood well over 6 feet tall, his frame filled out with the muscles of athletic endeavor, his features refined into classical handsomeness. His dark hair was cut in the fashionable Brutus style, and he wore evening dress of impeccable quality. Yet his eyes, those dark eyes that had once looked at her with brotherly affection, were unmistakable, and in that moment they reflected absolute shock. For an instant that seemed to stretch into eternity, the elegant woman before him, painted and dressed like a courtesan, overlaid itself upon the memory of a copper-haired child of 9, with grass-stained skirts and a laugh like morning bells. The dissonance between memory and reality struck him with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. His gaze dropped to the handkerchief clutched in her trembling hand, and though he could not see the initials from where he stood, something in the way she held it, as though it were the last fragment of her former self, completed the terrible recognition. The name that escaped her lips came unbidden, shattering the careful composure she had maintained. With it came the collapse of every defense she had constructed over 3 weeks of shame and 12 years of loss. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen had he not crossed the room with shocking speed to catch her in his arms. What followed remained somewhat confused in Amelia's memory, clouded as it was by shock and the tears that had flowed unchecked once they began. She had been aware of Christopher's voice, tight with fury, speaking to Mrs. Marchmont in tones that permitted no argument. She had heard the rustle of banknotes being counted, far more than the sum originally agreed upon. She had felt herself being wrapped in Christopher's greatcoat, felt him lift her as easily as though she weighed nothing, felt the night air strike her face as he carried her from that place of shame into the relative innocence of the London street. He had taken her to his mother's townhouse in Mayfair, one of those grand establishments on Berkeley Square that spoke of old money and older titles. The servants had been roused despite the late hour, and the Dowager Countess of Windermere herself, woken by the commotion, had appeared at the top of the stairs in her dressing gown, her graying hair in a plait down her back. Amelia had been vaguely aware of Christopher speaking to his mother in urgent tones, of the Dowager Countess's sharp intake of breath, and then of gentle hands guiding her up the stairs to a guest chamber. She had slept the sleep of utter exhaustion, her dreams troubled by fire and shame and the ghostly echo of Christopher's voice speaking her name. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through unfamiliar windows, and a maid was setting a tray of chocolate and toast upon the bedside table. The girl had bobbed a curtsy and informed her that her ladyship requested Miss Hartwell's presence in the morning room when she was sufficiently recovered to come down. The morning room of Windermere House was decorated in shades of yellow and cream, designed to capture the sunlight that now poured through its tall windows. The Dowager Countess sat beside a small fire, her posture speaking of a lifetime of aristocratic bearing, her expression carefully neutral. She was a handsome woman still, despite her 50 years, her dark hair barely touched with silver and her figure maintained by careful attention to diet and exercise. She had been kind to Amelia in childhood, though their interactions had been limited by considerations of rank and age. The Dowager Countess had been direct, a trait Amelia remembered from childhood. Christopher had explained the circumstances of their encounter, though he had been vague on certain particulars out of consideration for Amelia's dignity. He had also explained the history of their childhood friendship and the tragedy that had separated them. Lady Windermere, for her part, remembered the sweet child Amelia had been, and was appalled by the depths to which Mrs. Talbot's neglect had allowed her to fall. A solution had been proposed. Amelia would remain at Windermere House as a guest, ostensibly a distant connection of the family who had recently suffered a reversal of fortune and was now serving as companion to the Dowager Countess. This arrangement would provide Amelia with respectable shelter whilst allowing her reputation to be rebuilt, at least to the extent such rebuilding was possible. She would take her meals with the family, accompany Lady Windermere on social calls, and to certain carefully selected entertainments, and in all ways conduct herself as a lady of quality. Amelia had accepted this charity with a gratitude too profound for words, though the weight of shame had remained heavy upon her shoulders. She had been acutely conscious that Christopher had paid a small fortune to secure her freedom from Mrs. Marchmont's establishment, creating a debt she could never hope to repay. She had been equally conscious that her presence in his mother's household represented a considerable risk to the family's reputation should her true circumstances become known. In those first weeks at Windermere House, Amelia had moved through her days in a sort of daze, scarcely able to believe in her deliverance. She had been provided with a wardrobe suitable to her supposed station, though the garments were necessarily simpler than those worn by ladies of the first fashion. She had taken her meals in her chamber more often than not, unable to face Christopher across the dining table without remembering the circumstances of their reunion. At night, she had been plagued by dreams that blended the fire that had killed her parents with the crimson walls of Mrs. Marchmont's establishment, waking, gasping, and drenched in perspiration. It had been Christopher who had coaxed her gradually back to something resembling normalcy. He had been unfailingly kind, treating her with the same brotherly affection he had shown in childhood, never referencing the establishment where he had found her, nor treating her with anything other than perfect respect. He had begun joining her for breakfast, speaking easily of inconsequential matters until she grew comfortable enough to respond. He had invited her to walk with him in the square gardens, always with a maid in attendance for propriety's sake, and had gradually drawn her into conversation about their shared memories of Hertfordshire. One afternoon, as they sat in the library whilst rain pattered against the windows, Christopher had reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrawn something small and worn. Without speaking, he had placed it upon the table between them. A gentleman's handkerchief, its edges frayed from years of carrying, with a faded embroidered AH still visible in one corner. Amelia had stared at it in disbelief, recognizing the token she had given him 12 years before, and when she had looked up at him with tears in her eyes, his expression had held a tenderness that made her heart ache with emotions she dared not name. Slowly, painfully, Amelia had begun to heal, though the scars of her trauma ran deep. Christopher's patience had been inexhaustible, his understanding beyond what she had any right to expect. When nightmares woke her screaming, it was his knock upon her chamber door that came first, his voice through the wood, asking if she was well, his presence outside, offering silent protection until she could sleep again. When a disturbance of her nerves overwhelmed her during Lady Windermere's morning calls, when the simple prospect of facing society's scrutiny left her breathless and trembling, it was Christopher's steadying hand upon her elbow that grounded her, his quiet presence that gave her courage to face the ton. There were moments, too, when Lady Windermere would sit at her escritoire in the evening light, and Amelia would observe her gaze drifting to rest upon a miniature portrait displayed there, its subject a young gentleman of the previous generation with kind eyes and an earnest expression. Something in those moments, a shadow of old sorrow crossing the Dowager Countess's features before she would collect herself with her habitual discipline, suggested that her ladyship understood more of matters of the heart than her pragmatic exterior would suggest. The astute observer would note, however, that Christopher's attention to Amelia extended beyond mere brotherly concern. There was a quality to the way his gaze followed her movements across a room, a particular gentleness in his voice when he addressed her, that spoke of emotions more complex than childhood friendship. Yet he had been scrupulous in maintaining propriety, never once overstepping the bounds of what was acceptable between a gentleman and a lady under his mother's protection. It was during these weeks of recovery that Amelia had begun to learn of the changes that had befallen the Beaumont family during the 12 years of their separation. Christopher's elder brother, William, who had been destined for the earldom, had died 3 years previously in a riding accident. The tragedy had thrust Christopher, then aged 20, into the position of heir apparent, complete with all the responsibilities he had once been spared. His father, the old Earl, had passed away the following year, leaving Christopher to assume the title at an age when most young men were still finding their way in the world. The weight of these responsibilities sat heavily upon Christopher's shoulders, though he bore them with grace. He had estates to manage, tenants to care for, a seat in the House of Lords that required his attention, and a mother whose ambitions for the family had not diminished with her husband's death. Lady Windermere, for all her kindness to Amelia, was a woman who understood the importance of advantageous alliances, and she had been quite clear about her expectations for her son's marriage. These expectations had taken concrete form in the person of Lady Beatrice Worthington, eldest daughter of the Earl of Strathmere. The betrothal had been arranged some 6 months prior to Christopher's discovery of Amelia, a union designed to unite two powerful families and strengthen the Beaumonts' political influence. Lady Beatrice was everything a countess should be: beautiful, accomplished, connected to the highest circles of society, and blessed with a dowry that would restore the portions of the Beaumont fortune that had been depleted by the old Earl's unfortunate investments. Amelia had been residing at Windermere House for nearly a month before she encountered Lady Beatrice in person. The meeting had taken place in the drawing room, where Lady Windermere was entertaining her future daughter-in-law for afternoon tea. Amelia, who had been attempting to read in the library, had been summoned to join them, ostensibly so that Lady Beatrice might meet her mother-in-law's new companion. Lady Beatrice had been a vision of fashionable perfection. Her golden hair arranged à la mode beneath a chip-straw bonnet trimmed with cherry ribbons, her form displayed to advantage in a walking dress of sprigged muslin that must have cost more than Amelia's entire wardrobe. She had been gracious in her greeting, her manners impeccable, yet there had been a coldness in her blue eyes as she had assessed Amelia that spoke of immediate and instinctive dislike. The conversation that followed had been a masterclass in polite warfare. Lady Beatrice had inquired sweetly about Amelia's family connections, her voice dripping with false sympathy when the tragic fire was mentioned. She had commented upon Amelia's hair, remarking that whilst red was not generally considered fashionable, it was certainly distinctive. She had asked after Amelia's accomplishments, her expression suggesting that the answers were precisely as inadequate as she had anticipated. Through it all, Lady Windermere had maintained her composure, deflecting the worst of the attacks, whilst Christopher, who had joined them partway through the visit, had grown increasingly tense. It had been after Lady Beatrice's departure that Christopher had sought out Amelia in the library, where she had retreated to nurse her wounded pride. He had apologized for his betrothed's behavior, though they both knew such apologies were inadequate. He had assured Amelia that Lady Beatrice was merely protective of her future position, that she would soften once the wedding had taken place, and she felt more secure. Yet even as he spoke these words, his expression had been troubled, as though he himself doubted their truth. The following weeks had brought a shift in the dynamics within Windermere House. Lady Beatrice had become a frequent visitor, her presence a constant reminder of the future that awaited Christopher. She had made it her particular mission to befriend Amelia, a campaign of false warmth that was somehow more unsettling than outright hostility. She would insist upon Amelia joining her for shopping expeditions, where she would select the most expensive items before remarking upon how fortunate Amelia was to have Lady Windermere's charity, since she clearly could not afford such luxuries herself. She would invite Amelia to accompany her to social events, then introduce her to others as dear Lady Windermere's impoverished relation, ensuring that Amelia's reduced circumstances were made clear to all. Christopher had been increasingly absent during this period, his duties requiring him to spend time at Silvermere Hall seeing to estate matters. When he was in residence, he had seemed preoccupied, his easy manner replaced by a tension that showed in the set of his shoulders and the lines that had begun to appear around his eyes. The conversations he shared with Amelia had grown briefer, more formal, as though he was deliberately creating distance between them. It had been during one of Christopher's absences at a musicale hosted by the Marchioness of Dalton that the first whispers had begun to circulate. The air in Lady Dalton's music room had been thick with the heat of hundreds of beeswax candles and the mingled scents of rice powder, lavender water, and the gardenias that drooped in their Chinese vases. The sound of a soprano struggling valiantly through an Italian aria competed with the constant hum of gossip whispered behind painted fans. Amelia had been standing near a window, attempting to cool herself with her own modest fan, when she had overheard a conversation between two matrons who believed themselves unobserved behind a potted palm. They had been discussing the mysterious Miss Hartwell, speculating upon her true origins and questioning the propriety of Lady Windermere's charity. One had wondered aloud whether there might be more to the story than was publicly known, whether perhaps Miss Hartwell's connection to the family was rather more intimate than was proper. The implication had been clear and utterly devastating. Amelia had felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that her presence in Christopher's household, however innocent, was providing fodder for exactly the sort of speculation that could destroy his reputation and prospects. She had made her excuses to Lady Windermere as soon as possible and had returned to Windermere House, her mind racing with the implications of what she had overheard. The following morning, Amelia had requested a private audience with Lady Windermere. In the Dowager Countess's private sitting room, surrounded by portraits of Beaumont ancestors who seemed to stare down in judgment, Amelia had explained what she had overheard. She had been prepared to offer her immediate departure, to remove herself from the household before the whispers could grow into open scandal. Yet Lady Windermere, whilst troubled by the news, had been adamant that Amelia should remain. To send her away now, the Dowager Countess had argued, would only confirm whatever suspicions existed. Better to weather the gossip and allow it to die down naturally than to create a scandal through precipitous action. Amelia had acquiesced, though the knowledge that her presence was causing harm to those who had shown her such kindness weighed heavily upon her conscience. She had become even more careful in her behavior, scrupulous in maintaining the fiction of her role as companion, avoiding any circumstance that might provide additional fuel for speculation. When Christopher returned from Silvermere Hall, she had been distant, her responses to his friendly overtures polite but cool, hoping that creating space between them might help to quell the rumors. Christopher, however, had not been content with distance. He had sought her out in the library one evening, dismissing the maid who should have been present and closing the door behind him in a breach of propriety that would have scandalized society had it been known. His expression had been one of concern mixed with frustration as he demanded to know what had changed, why she had withdrawn from him so completely. Amelia had attempted to maintain her composure, to deflect his questions with vague assurances that nothing was amiss. Yet Christopher had been relentless, his questions cutting through her defenses until the truth had spilled forth in a rush of words. She had told him about the whispers, about her fear that her presence was damaging his reputation, about the debt of gratitude she owed him that could never be repaid, but that she could at least attempt to discharge by causing him no further harm. What followed had been a moment of truth neither of them had been prepared to face. Christopher had stood before her, his hands clenched at his sides, his expression tortured, and had admitted that he no longer thought of her as the childhood friend he had sworn to protect. He had confessed that somewhere between finding her in that terrible place and watching her slowly heal within his mother's home, his feelings had transformed into something far deeper and more dangerous. He had acknowledged that such feelings were impossible, that he was promised to another, that his duty to his family and his betrothed must supersede his personal desires. Yet he had been unable to continue the pretense that his regard for her was merely fraternal. Amelia had listened to this confession with a heart that felt as though it might shatter from the weight of impossible longing. For she too had been forced to acknowledge, in the quiet hours of night when honesty could no longer be denied, that her feelings for Christopher had evolved beyond the boundaries of childhood friendship. She had fallen in love with the man who had saved her, who had shown her such patience and kindness, who made her feel safe for the first time since the fire that had claimed her parents. Yet she had also been acutely aware that such love was futile, that Christopher's future was already determined, and that her own circumstances made her entirely unsuitable as a bride for an earl. They had stood together in the library, the truth laid bare between them, both understanding that acknowledgement changed nothing. Christopher was honor-bound to his betrothal, and Amelia would never ask him to break such a promise. They had agreed, with the painful wisdom of those who love without hope, that he would proceed with his wedding to Lady Beatrice as planned, and that Amelia would seek a position elsewhere before the marriage took place. It was the only solution that preserved Christopher's honor whilst acknowledging the impossibility of their situation. Yet for Christopher, who had lost his brother to fate and nearly lost Amelia to circumstance, the prospect of a life bound to duty rather than love had begun to feel less like honor and more like a slow death of the spirit. Yet Providence, as mentioned before, is a capricious mistress, and she had not finished with Amelia Hartwell and Christopher Beaumont. The very next morning, a visitor had arrived at Windermere House, a visitor whose presence would set in motion events that would bring all carefully laid plans tumbling down like a house of cards. Mrs. Violet Marchmont, dressed in respectable widow's weeds and carrying herself with an air of injured dignity, had presented herself at the front door and had requested an audience with the Dowager Countess of Windermere. The butler, recognizing quality when he saw it, despite the dubious nature of Mrs. Marchmont's actual occupation, had shown her into the morning room and had informed Lady Windermere of her visitor. Lady Windermere, accompanied by a suspicious and protective Amelia, had received Mrs. Marchmont with icy courtesy. The proprietress had wasted little time on pleasantries, instead presenting the Dowager Countess with a proposition that was nothing short of blackmail. The sum Christopher had paid for Amelia's freedom, whilst generous, had not been sufficient to compensate Mrs. Marchmont for the loss of such a valuable asset, particularly given the premium price Lord Renwick had been prepared to pay. Unless Mrs. Marchmont received an additional payment of £500, she would feel compelled to share with certain members of the ton the interesting circumstances under which Lord Windermere had acquired his mother's new companion. The threat had been delivered with perfect politeness, but its implications were devastating. £500 was not an inconsiderable sum, yet it was the principle of submitting to extortion that truly troubled Lady Windermere. More troubling still was the knowledge that paying once would not end the matter, that Mrs. Marchmont would return again and again, her demands increasing with each visit. Yet refusing to pay would result in precisely the scandal they had been attempting to avoid, a scandal that would destroy not only Amelia's tenuous position in society, but also Christopher's betrothal and political prospects. Lady Windermere had requested time to consider the matter, and Mrs. Marchmont had graciously allowed her 3 days to produce the funds. The proprietress had departed with the smug satisfaction of one who knows she holds all the advantages, leaving behind a household in turmoil. Christopher, summoned from his chambers where he had been reviewing correspondence, had been incandescent with rage upon learning of Mrs. Marchmont's visit. He had been prepared to pay whatever sum was demanded, to spend his entire fortune if necessary to protect Amelia from exposure. Yet even as plans were made to secure the funds, Mrs. Marchmont had not waited the full 3 days. A vague rumor, poisonous in its imprecision, had begun to circulate through the less scrupulous drawing rooms of Mayfair. Whispers of Lord Windermere's mysterious protégé, speculation about the true nature of her connection to the family, suggestions that perhaps the young Earl had developed tastes that ran contrary to his public betrothal. The gossip was carefully crafted to damage without providing grounds for legal action, and it spread with the inexorable speed of all malicious ondite. Lady Beatrice, upon hearing these whispers, had descended upon Windermere House in a fury of righteous indignation. In the drawing room, before Lady Windermere and several visitors who happened to be present, she had demanded to know the truth of Miss Hartwell's origins. When no satisfactory answer was immediately forthcoming, she had announced in ringing tones that she would not be made a fool of, that she refused to enter a marriage clouded by such unseemly speculation, and that unless the matter was resolved to her complete satisfaction, she would consider the betrothal at an end. The confrontation had been precisely what Mrs. Marchmont had intended, forcing Christopher's hand in the most public manner possible. Yet as Lady Beatrice had stood there, her beautiful face contorted with anger and wounded pride, Christopher had felt something shift within him. He had looked at his betrothed, this woman he had agreed to marry out of duty and family obligation, and had realized that he felt nothing save a faint sense of relief at the prospect of freedom from their arrangement. Then his gaze had moved to Amelia, standing pale and stricken beside the window, clearly preparing to accept full blame for the scandal in order to protect him, and he had known with absolute clarity what he must do. The choice before him was not between honor and disgrace, but between a life lived according to others' expectations and a life lived according to the truth of his own heart. Christopher had turned to Lady Beatrice and, in a voice that carried to every corner of the now silent room, had informed her that she need not trouble herself with ending their betrothal, as he was doing so himself. He had acknowledged that his regard for Miss Hartwell had evolved beyond the bounds of propriety, that he loved her with a depth that made marriage to another woman impossible, and that whilst he regretted any embarrassment this might cause Lady Beatrice, he could not in good conscience proceed with their planned union. The life he had been constructing before Amelia's return, a life of duty, advantageous alliances, and responsibilities discharged without joy, was not the honor his father had taught him to cherish, but rather a slow surrender of everything that made existence meaningful. In saving Amelia from her circumstances, he had come to realize he was also saving himself from a future spent as a pale shadow of his brother, fulfilling expectations whilst his own spirit withered from neglect. Their salvation had been mutual, their redemption intertwined from the moment he had spoken her name in that crimson chamber. The scandal that erupted in the wake of this announcement had been immediate and spectacular. Lady Beatrice had departed in tears of rage, vowing that both Christopher and Amelia would be utterly ruined in society. The visitors present had hurried away to spread the shocking news. Mrs. Marchmont, learning that her leverage had evaporated with the broken betrothal, had attempted one final play, sending word that she would expose Amelia's time in the establishment to anyone who would listen. Christopher's response had been swift and merciless. He had engaged the services of a particular solicitor known for his effectiveness in matters requiring discretion and force, and had sent that gentleman to call upon Mrs. Marchmont with a choice. She could cease her threats immediately and depart London for an extended period, or Christopher would use his considerable influence to ensure that her establishment was subjected to the full scrutiny of the law, that her prominent patrons were informed their names were no longer secure, and that she herself would find it impossible to conduct business in London or any other city of quality. Faced with certain ruin, Mrs. Marchmont had chosen the wiser course and had departed for the continent within the week. Yet Amelia had been overwhelmed, torn between desperate hope and terrible fear of the consequences his choice would bring. She had attempted to make him see reason, to understand that marrying her would cost him his mother's approval, his political allies, his standing in society. Yet Christopher had been immovable in his resolution. He had lost one brother to death, and had nearly lost Amelia to circumstances beyond his control. He would not lose her again to propriety or convention, not when he had been given a second chance to choose love over duty. Lady Windermere, who had witnessed the entire scene unfold, had requested a private audience with her son. What passed between them was known only to the two participants, but when they emerged from the library an hour later, the Dowager Countess had gone directly to Amelia. She had taken the younger woman's hands in her own and had spoken with a candor that surprised them both. She had confessed that she too had once been in love with a man her family had deemed unsuitable, a younger son of good family but insufficient fortune named Henry Taverner. The miniature portrait upon her escritoire was his likeness, kept as a reminder of what she had sacrificed to duty. She had married Christopher's father in an arrangement that had been comfortable and respectful, but never passionate, and she had spent her life wondering what might have been had she possessed the courage to choose differently. She had raised her sons to understand their duty, but she had also hoped they might find more in marriage than she herself had known. Now, watching Christopher prepared to risk everything for love, she recognized the courage she had lacked, and she would not stand in his way. Then, she had looked at Amelia directly, not with pity, but with a new and profound respect. Her next words had carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. She had told Amelia that she herself had chosen the safe path and had regretted it every day since, but that Amelia, her dear girl, had survived a hell that would have destroyed most women entirely. She had urged Amelia not to mistake her quietness for weakness, for true strength was not found in loud declarations, but in the resilience of steel that bends without breaking. If Christopher wished to marry Amelia Hartwell, he would do so with his mother's blessing, and society be damned. Amelia had wept then, overcome by the Dowager Countess's unexpected support and by the magnitude of what was being offered to her. Christopher, obtaining a special license with a speed that suggested he feared she might change her mind or disappear again, had arranged for them to be married within the week at St. George's, Hanover Square. The service would be private, attended only by family and the most loyal of friends, but it would be legal and binding, uniting them in a way that scandal could never sever. On the morning of the wedding, as Amelia dressed in a gown of pale blue silk that Lady Windermere had insisted upon commissioning, she had found a small package upon her dressing table. Inside had been a strand of pearls that had belonged to Christopher's grandmother, along with a note in Christopher's hand explaining that these pearls had been worn by every Beaumont bride for 3 generations, and that he wished her to have them as a symbol that she was truly and completely his family now. The ceremony itself had been simple but profoundly moving. As Christopher had placed the ring upon Amelia's finger, a band of gold inscribed on the inside with the words, "Eternal as the oak," she had felt the weight of 12 years of grief and shame finally lift from her shoulders. The words of the service had bound them legally, but the promises exchanged in looks and gentle touches had sealed a bond that went far deeper than any legal contract. When the vicar had pronounced them man and wife, and Christopher had kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache with joy, Amelia had known with absolute certainty that whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together. The aftermath of their marriage had been turbulent indeed. The Earl of Strathmere had been apoplectic upon learning that his daughter had been jilted, and he had used his considerable influence to ensure that Christopher's political prospects were severely damaged. Lady Beatrice, her pride wounded beyond repair, had undertaken a systematic campaign to destroy Amelia's reputation, spreading carefully worded rumors that stopped just short of actionable slander. Many of the families who had once welcomed Christopher into their homes now found excuses to be unavailable when he called. Invitations that should have been forthcoming failed to materialize. The scandal, as predicted, had been considerable. Yet there had been unexpected allies as well. Certain members of the ton, those who valued love over convention or who had their own reasons for sympathizing with marriages made against familial objections, had continued to receive the newlyweds. A group of reform-minded peers, impressed by Christopher's willingness to defy convention when principle demanded it, had actually sought him out, recognizing in him a man of independent thought who might be a valuable ally in their efforts to modernize certain antiquated laws. Lady Windermere, true to her word, had stood firmly by her son's choice, her support lending them a degree of respectability that might otherwise have been impossible to achieve. Within 6 months of their marriage, Christopher had been appointed to a parliamentary committee investigating the conditions of child labor in factories and mines. The appointment had come not despite his scandalous marriage, but in some measure because of it, for his actions had marked him as a man willing to place conscience above convenience. He had thrown himself into this work with passion, finding in it a purpose more meaningful than the social and political maneuvering that had occupied so much of his time before Amelia's return to his life. For Amelia, the transition to her new role as Countess of Windermere had been both challenging and healing. She had been required to face society as Christopher's wife, to endure the whispers and the deliberate cuts with her head held high, knowing that her husband stood beside her. The nightmares that had plagued her since the fire had gradually diminished in frequency and intensity, as though the security of Christopher's love had provided the foundation she needed to finally confront and release her childhood trauma. It had been on a visit to Silvermere Hall, some 8 months after their marriage, that the final piece of healing had occurred. Christopher had taken Amelia through the woods to the old oak that marked the boundary between Silvermere and what had once been Hartwell Manor. The manor itself had been rebuilt by its new owners, a prosperous merchant family from London, but the oak remained unchanged, as solid and enduring as it had been in their childhood. Standing beneath its branches, with Christopher's arm around her waist, Amelia had finally been able to speak of the candle in the library, of her secret guilt that she had caused the fire that killed her parents. Christopher had listened without judgment, then had gently pointed out what her trauma had prevented her from seeing: that a single candle, properly extinguished or simply burning down in its holder, could not have caused such a devastating fire. That the magistrate's finding of an overturned lamp in her father's study had been the true cause, a tragic accident that had nothing to do with Amelia's innocent reading. That she had been a child, and that the guilt she had carried was as unjust as every other burden that had been placed upon her shoulders. The relief that had flooded through Amelia in that moment had been almost overwhelming. 12 years of secret guilt, of believing herself responsible for her parents' deaths, had been released in a rush of tears that Christopher had absorbed with patient understanding. When she had finally composed herself, she had realized that the weight she had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a lightness she had not felt since childhood. They had remained at Silvermere Hall for several months following that visit, Christopher managing his estates whilst Amelia had slowly come to know and be accepted by the tenants and servants who would be part of her life. She had discovered a talent for management and a genuine interest in the welfare of those who depended upon the estate for their livelihoods. She had also discovered, to her surprised delight, that she was with child, that the love she and Christopher shared would soon bear its most tangible fruit. Their daughter, born the following spring, had been named Sarah Amelia Beaumont, after both of her grandmothers. She had inherited her mother's copper hair and her father's dark eyes, and from her first moments, she had been loved with an intensity that sometimes brought tears to Amelia's eyes. The baby had represented more than just a new life. She had been a symbol of hope and redemption, proof that even the darkest circumstances could give rise to something beautiful. In the years that followed, Christopher and Amelia had built a life that balanced their responsibilities to the estate and to society with their private happiness. They had 2 more children, a son named Thomas after Amelia's father, and another daughter, Victoria, whose sunny disposition brought joy to all who knew her. The scandal of their marriage had gradually faded from immediate memory, replaced by the reputation they had built through Christopher's parliamentary work and Amelia's charitable activities amongst the poor of London's East End. They were known as a devoted couple, perhaps eccentric in the depth of their mutual affection, but respected nonetheless for their integrity and genuine commitment to reform. Lady Windermere, who had lived to see her grandchildren grow into lively, affectionate youngsters, had confessed to Amelia one afternoon that she had been wrong to value political advantage over personal happiness, that watching Christopher and Amelia together had shown her what marriage could be when founded on genuine love rather than strategic alliance, that she was grateful her son had possessed the courage she had lacked in her own youth, and that she could not imagine her life without the grandchildren and daughter-in-law that courage had brought her. The miniature of Henry Taverner had been moved from her private escritoire to a place of honor in the family gallery, a small but significant acknowledgement of a love she had once denied. On the occasion of their 10th wedding anniversary, Christopher and Amelia had returned to London for the season, bringing their children to experience the city where their parents' lives had intersected in such dramatic fashion. They had been invited to a ball at Devonshire House, a clear sign that they had been substantially restored to society's good graces, though the whispers had never completely disappeared, serving as a constant reminder of the price they had paid for their love. As they had stood together at the edge of the ballroom, watching the dancers swirl past in their finery, Christopher had leaned close to whisper in Amelia's ear, asking if she regretted the difficulties their marriage had brought. Amelia had turned to look at him, this man who had saved her not once but repeatedly, who had chosen her when every reasonable consideration had counseled against it, who had loved her through trauma and scandal and had never once made her feel that she was less than worthy of that love. She had smiled, the same brilliant smile that had once lit up the gardens of Hartwell Manor, and had told him with absolute certainty that she regretted nothing. That every trial they had faced had been worth enduring for the joy of being his wife, the mother of his children, and the mistress of his heart. Christopher had kissed her then, heedless of the watching crowd, a gesture of affection that would have scandalized society a decade earlier, but that now merely prompted indulgent smiles from those who observed it. They had been through fire, both literal and metaphorical, and had emerged not merely unscathed, but strengthened. Their love, forged in the darkest of circumstances and tested by the harshest of trials, had proven itself unbreakable. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, and those brave enough to choose it over duty, despite all costs and consequences, discover that the reward is worth any sacrifice. In the annals of the ton, there would be many marriages celebrated for their advantageous connections and prudent arrangements. But few would be remembered with the warmth and admiration accorded to the Earl and Countess of Windermere, whose devotion to one another became a legend whispered in drawing rooms for generations hence. For theirs was a love that had conquered death, scandal, and social censure, proving that redemption comes not merely to those who seek it, but to those brave enough to seize it when Providence offers a second chance. And in that redemption, both Amelia and Christopher found not only salvation from their separate sorrows, but the truest expression of what it means to choose love when all the world counsels otherwise.